Welcome, listeners. Time Trippers are currently having some technical issues. We were due to be going back to the 1916 Battle of the Somme to look at some different schools of thought, lions led by donkeys theory. But Jonny has been watching on the Time Machine navigation console not only the Lord of the Rings extended edition trilogy, Jonny, but also the Netflix documentary Hitler, Moustache of Evil. You've scrambled the time machine.
The year is 1916. We are time tripping the Battle of the Somme.
Listeners and viewers, we are in the Battle of the Somme 1916, but we are very much focused on two individuals, one from the German side, one from the British side.
Just two normal individuals, aren't they, Jonny? But they're not, are they?
They're far from normal. I would say, though, they are perhaps amongst the most famous participants of the Somme.
If that's what we're doing, comparing and contrasting Tolkien and Hitler, both of them arguably made at the Somme, it does sound a bit like we're going down a very filthy path of popular history, chasing views and engagement.
Subscribe now. Inscrivez-vous maintenant. Subscribe now.
Quick smattering of background about the Somme.
Dan Snow's great-great-grandfather was almost solely responsible for quite a lot of deaths, and he blamed his troops later. Dan Snow himself said it on History Hit.
Well, let's not point too many fingers of whether people were lions or donkeys. The fact is, there was an awful lot of carnage, a lot of bloodshed. I think on the first day alone, when the British started sending waves after waves of men over the top after a ineffective artillery barrage. First day alone they lost something like 20,000 casualties.
60,000, in fact.
Was it 60,000? Goodness. Maybe it was 20,000 killed. Anyway, a staggering amount of lives wasted in the Somme, both on the British side and the French side and the German side. And this battle was grinding on for months. It sort of wrapped up round about November for a gain of 5 or 6 miles and a loss of hundreds of thousands of casualties. I think around 600,000 casualties on the German side, 250,000 on the British and French side. They each lost about 250,000. So, for the amount of lives that were wasted, very little gained. And it was a typical trench warfare, like just sending men over the top, human waves. Very, very bad business.
As you say, the artillery bombardment was unsuccessful. The idea was that it would reduce the enemy defences, barbed wire, etc., to mush, and the idea that the men would simply walk into no man's land, which some of them actually did, particularly on a few real problem points of the line. But thanks to your ingenuity, Jonny, the time machine has already arrived at the northern point of the Somme, and I think we're about to catch up with the Lancashire Fusiliers Regiment, where a young J.R.R. Tolkien is arriving for his first active service at the Battle of the Somme.
Well, let's find out then what John Ronald was doing here.
Oh, someone knows John Ronald's name. Of course, we're talking about both Tolkien and Hitler. So please continue to direct all abuse, pedantry in the comments section below. We try and reply to all of them. We do reply to all of them. John Ronald, here he is.
Any author, I imagine, is obliged to call on his stock, private stock.
Is this another word for what Freud would call the unconscious?
No.
The Somme had a profound effect on Tolkien, the extent of which we can discuss, but that is generally accepted and sourced on the one wiki to rule them all. Tolkien arrived as a signalling officer for the Lancashire Fusiliers just in time for the Somme. And he'd sort of come with a little bit of a fellowship of old school friends who had come with him through Oxford. Oh, sorry, did I say fellowship? Tolkien hated the idea that people would interpret his work ever as like literal allegory. You know, say Pippin equals Robert Gilson. The point is that by the end of the Somme later that year, at least two of them will be dead. Two of the fellowship will be dead, with another one to die the next year, and Tolkien will be recovering from terrible trench fever, thankfully escorted way away from France. The only good aspect of this, though, is of course that Tolkien has a little time to convalesce and write.
Well, Lord of the Rings can be read as a war novel. The effects that it has on the characters, like the fact that the hobbits, the Fellowship, are almost a bit shell-shocked. They never really recover and readjust at the end of the trilogy. They can't really re-assimilate back into the Shire because of what they've witnessed, and I think this is very much taken from Tolkien's personal experience and sort of his reflections when he came back from the war.
He was once criticised by an interviewer, or rather asked a question that implied that it all had a really happy ending. So he's a bit like, so Mr. Tolkien, you know, do you write these fairy stories with happy endings, whatever? And Tolkien's a bit like, have you read the ends? Like, they come back, they're shell-shocked, and they find that their whole town has been taken over by greedy sort of slave-driving industrialist wizards or something, and they have to literally kill them all. It's known, of course, as the Scouring of the Shire, omitted from the film because it doesn't really fit in the dramatic structure.
Indeed, yeah, and Frodo, he is haunted, we can say physically even, by his injuries. I think he talks about how he has like anniversary pains of the main injuries he gets, like the bite from Shelob, the spider, and the Nazgul blade. On the anniversary of these injuries, it plays up again. So it's something that he's physically scarred from and mentally scarred from. Like physically scarred because he's got these wounds on his body, and they play up from time to time. And they're mentally scarred because he just can't readjust to his beloved Shire. He has to go off with the elves to the better world.
Tolkien firstly started comprehensively kind of designing the mechanics and languages of the world, which is quite an unusual approach. But then would sort of the first novel out of it would be The Hobbit, of course, There and Back Again. And it's very tempting, I think, to read into that as Bilbo's adventure sort of being in World War One, and he sort of comes back changed. And then, of course, it's so tempting to see the in-between bit as the interwar years and Frodo learning from Bilbo, but a darkness descending. As I say, important to keep going back to that Tolkien was really keen that he hadn't approached it like this. He sort of admits that his experiences obviously shape him, but he was pretty he didn't like the idea that one thing stood for one thing. But as you say, like, I think it's generally accepted that a lot of the flavours of war and things like that do come into it. A little later, of course, we can go berserk and make Tolkien spin in his grave as we apply wildly delicious Lord of the Rings and Hobbit Tolkien legendarium analogies directly and literally to the war and the wars.
So what was Tolkien's role? He was in the Lancashire Fusiliers, but he wasn't like a grunt, was he? He wasn't
no, he was
like going over the top regularly, because chances are he just wouldn't have survived that, I suppose.
No, I mean the officers did go over the top though. They had to lead their men over, so it was quite dangerous. But he was a signalling officer. I love the way I'm trying to find out what his actual rank is in the Time Machine notes, when it's just riddled with like Morgoth's Iron Dragons. J.R. Tolkien basically said of the war, "I was pitched into it all just when I was full of stuff to write and of things to learn, and never picked it all up again." So he does sound a little Bilbo-ish talking about it and sort of losing a little part of himself along the way. I should say, for pedants quickly, the main thing that comes out of his sick leave is kind of the beginnings of one of his so-called lost tales called The Fall of Gondolin, which is supposedly quite directly influenced by him being in the trench and the flamethrowers coming over, men with flamethrowers coming over the top at him, and all of that sort of stuff. So they reckon the Fall of Gondolin ends up later in the Silmarillion, but obviously he uses elements in all of it. So his regiment, the Lancashire Fusiliers, but were stationed in Beaumont, so sort of to the north of the Somme, near the Hamel, Seine and Leipzig salient trenches. To answer your question, Tolkien was a second lieutenant in the British Expeditionary Force, and he recalled, "Junior officers were being killed off, dozen a minute. Parting from my wife," he wrote, doubting that he would survive the trenches, "was like a death." This is from a New York Times article by Joseph LeConte from 2016, by the way. And it says, "Though the debt is largely overlooked, Tolkien's supreme literary achievement, The Lord of the Rings, owes a great deal to his experience at the Somme." You and I now know, Jonny, that's sort of, kind of, we've done our caveats. But yeah, what he did was to use telephone, signal lights, flares, pigeons and runners to maintain communications between the army staff directing the battles from the rear and the officers in the field. According to British historian Martin Gilbert, who interviewed Tolkien decades later, he came under intense enemy fire. He had heard the fearful cries of men who had been hit. So Tolkien and his signallers, Gilbert wrote, were always very vulnerable. But it was, he recalled, by candlelight in bell tents, even some down in dugouts under shell fire, when he was recuperating from trench fever. He began composing a series of tales involving gnomes. That's right, gnomes. Dwarves and orcs, but specifically gnomes to start with, engaged in a great struggle for his imaginary realm. In the rent earth of the Somme Valley, he laid the foundation of his epic trilogy. Lord of the Rings, of course, will become the second most read book of the 20th century, second only to the Bible. So there we go, Jonny. Good to be on Team Tolkien, this side of the trenches. Looking forward to catching up with what I like to call Team Hitler, led by you. Because I reckon there's going to be some brilliant mirrors, but a sort of distorted, hideous Hitler mirror that you endorse.
I wouldn't say I'm endorsing it. I'm a reluctant member of Team Hitler. Interesting, just before we see what Adolf is up to in the trenches. Interesting that he was referring to them as gnomes. I'm glad he didn't keep the hobbits as gnomes, because when I think of gnome, I think of these horrid little garden ornaments with like conical red pointy hat and beard, and just surefire way to devalue any garden is to stick a gnome in it. So,
but Jonny, had he used gnomes, and let's say it became successful anyway, would that have changed probably the word gnomes in your head? Does that make sense?
I
They were
don't
also
think
known as,
so. I think for me a gnome will always be like a weird little half half a dwarf. Like they're too similar to dwarfs, really. They're like a
I've got
small
some,
dwarf.
it seems so, but I've got some quite good facts about the canonical gnomes, or the Noldoli, used in early versions of Tolkien's Legendarian. Back to the one wiki to rule them all. Sorry, I mean our time machine as a source. The Noldoli spoke the Gnomish or Goldorin language and wrote using the gnomic letters. So, letters from Father Christmas? What the hell? Oh, J.R. Tolkien wrote and illustrated letters for his children from Father Christmas, released posthumously. And it was been suggested that elements of the stories inspired parts of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. So these gnomes show up also in letters from Father Christmas, which isn't canonical. God, Jonny, you've scrambled the time machine. The viewers just want to hear all the stats about the Somme, and they want us to be respectful, and we're talking about gnomes when we're under fire in the trenches.
There were 10 massive, huge, biblical proportion style mines that were blown up on the first British attack. They'd like mined under the German trenches and then set off these huge mines.
Yes, I see where you're going with this, Jonny.
I think dwarfs are known more for mining, but I think gnomes would probably be quite handy in a pinch with a pickaxe.
Oh, gotcha. Sorry, I thought you were. I was thinking of the explosive mines and was thinking about the Uruk-hai that runs at Helm's Deep with it to light the bomb under the fortification.
Yeah, that is also similar. Perhaps Tolkien was somewhat influenced by this idea of like undermining a foundation, a defensive foundation by a mine, because this is what the sappers would do in the trenches. They would dig and dig and dig for months to get under the enemy trenches, plant a huge amount of explosives, and then boom, blow it up. With the idea of creating a breach in the defensive lines. I'm sure Tolkien would have heard about this and perhaps got his idea, for the breach in the defense of Helm's Deep from this. Who knows?
Yeah, the devilry of Saruman, the fire of Orthanc, used in the book to blast a culvert to bring down a large fortifications, referred to as blasting fire by Aragorn. The exact nature of the devilry of Saruman is unknown. Quickly though, there's a little debate going on Reddit. Does the Uruk-hai, this guy here, does the Uruk-hai running with the bomb at Helm's Deep, did he jump or did he trip?
I thought he made like a last gasp dive.
Yeah, agreed. Definitely not a trip. Have a little...
like some bumbling oaf of an Uruk-hai. Good thing he didn't trip like 40 feet further back.
Had it been a scene in the later Hobbit trilogy, he probably would have tripped. And it would have gone boing, and all the dwarfs would have fallen over and bounced around and all of that stuff. But that's rubbish. We don't need to talk about the Hobbit trilogy.
Indeed.
Yeah, everyone's on Team Jump. He jumped out of desperation because he was getting lit up, someone says. Yep. Team Jump. Someone says, oh, I agree, stumbles. I think he stumbled because he had a bunch of arrows in him. It's a sort of a cross, though, isn't it? He knows he's going to die, but he just, does his job.
He's got one job, hasn't he? Like, one job. If he trips, he's ruined that one job. So, he's quite an elite member of the Uruk-hai. He's been chosen for this role because he's big and strong and fast. I don't put much stock in the idea that he's stumbled his way over the finish line.
Exactly. And if you're just listening, this is 1916, the Somme. Tolkien versus Hitler. Tolkien was sort of something of a sapper, and they would dig under fortifications and blow things up. So we are now discussing the Urukai that runs at the Helm's Deep foundations. Probably didn't need to reorientate us, but there we go. Here's our boy Tolkien. So not having a great Somme so far. It's worth.
I don't think many had a great Somme.
Well, there's always the schools of thought that says, oh no, lots of people enjoyed the war. I don't know if enjoyed is the right word though. But the first day was a disaster, but actually the rest of the battle apparently wasn't quite so incompetent. Our Tolkien's here getting all sorts of ideas. He might, in a few months, invent a character called Legolas Greenleaf, everyone's least favourite character in the films. And my bow. But yes, of course, Tolkien had a fellowship. They were called the Tea Club or something, the Tea Club Barovian, the Tea Club and Barovian Society, reference to so the TCBS, a little literary clique. So the three friends, I've mentioned them briefly, Robert Gilson, Geoffrey Batchett Smith, and Christopher Wiseman, formed their semi-secret society called the Tea Club, which I imagine is like a very polite Bullingdon club. I think they did do some slightly Bullingdon Club-ish things. I think he used to sit with his girlfriend and they used to try and throw sugar cubes in people's hats at tea shops. So yeah, four little hobbits, sorry, I mean people, humans, go off to war, and certainly two or three of them die. And there's a lot of that, as linking it back to the books again, of course, a lot of comradely death and sort of honour in war. Like, of course, who else is which other poets are at this battle?
You got Siegfried Sassoon, I believe.
Yeah.
Maybe Robert Graves, I think he was also fighting on the Somme somewhere.
And that's totally distinct, isn't it, to like Tolkien's approach to war, which feels almost slightly more removed, looking back to an age of honour in warfare before technology took over and all of that sort of. So it's quite interesting, and you can see why he does come under a little flack, Tolkien, later on for sort of, are you glorifying war, etc., etc., which I don't think is fair. But there's a bit of glory as well. He accepts that there's glory too, and excitement and heroism.
Yeah. I don't think we can say that there's too much glory in the mud of the Somme. I think a lot of people really became disillusioned by their time in the trenches in this absolute meat grinder of a battle. And I think there is one nod to the Somme directly in Lord of the Rings when Frodo and Sam are going through the dead marshes, coming up to the approach of Mordor, and the description here, it just seems like the sucking, oozing mud of the Somme, and that he's talking about seeing dead faces staring back up at him from the mud.
Yes, that scene in the film done very well with just that, and that pale kind of, and it's sort of like the kind of siren call almost of the dead, like, isn't there? He's sort of like, Frodo's almost drawn to it, and yeah. And apparently Tolkien, I think that's one of the few ones that Tolkien actually acknowledged, the dead marshes with their pools of muck and floating corpses, in quotes, owe something to northern France after the Battle of the Somme. So I think the idea is that the Somme is like the fall of Gondolin, if you like, and that sort of seeds the dead marshes with the dead that are later encountered by Frodo and Sam.
Yeah, I've got the passage actually. I can read it out real quick.
Oh yeah.
Mists curled and smoked from dark and noisome pools. The reek of them hung stifling in the still air. Sam fell and came heavily on his hands, which sank deep into sticky ooze, so that his face was brought close to the surface of the dark mere. There was a faint hiss and a noisome smell went up. The lights flickered and danced and swirled. For a moment, the water below him looked like some window glazed with grimy glass, through which he was peering. Wrenching his hands out of the bog, he sprang back with a cry. "There are dead things, dead faces in the water," he said with horror. "Dead faces." And yeah, I can really see this like image of the mud of the trenches and seeing the dead bodies littering the battlefield. I'm sure that Tolkien was drawing on some of his experiences when writing this passage.
And it's certainly that I've read a lot of other soldiers describing the weird kind of the relationship with the dead. Like, it's not like they're going past like weeping for them necessarily. Like, there's a sort of like a weird, I don't know what I mean exactly, an impersonal.
I think that they're probably at this point surrounded by death so much that it does become a bit commonplace. Like it's horrific to think now about tens of thousands of people dying in one day of battle, but for the Somme, that wasn't out of the ordinary. It was almost like another day in the battle to have these nameless, faceless amounts of dead people.
Certainly at the siege of Gondor, Tolkien describes orcs as digging lines of deep trenches in a huge ring, while others maneuver great engines for the casting of missiles. On the path to Mordor, the air is filled with a bitter reek that caught their breath and parched their mouths. It's lovely doing it like this, just having a good old look at it through Tolkien. I suppose we're going to have to go to the other side soon.
Yeah, we should do the other side justice, because it wasn't just the British fighting, it was also the French and, of course, the Germans defending their lines.
Yeah, but the problem is, because the time machine's broken and we're focusing on Hitler, we can't really do them justice, can we? Because we've literally picked one of the time machines broken and picked Hitler of all Germans.
Inscrivez-vous maintenant.
His injury to his thigh was from the Somme. In March, he was in a place called Fromelles, which was a little bit north of where the Somme is. And then his regiment was pulled out of the lines in Fromelles in end of September, and sent to the Somme. And this was where he was caught out in the open under a British sort of rolling barrage and wounded by shrapnel in the thigh. And his Somme doesn't last that long, really. He arrives in, I think, September the 27th at the Somme and is injured on October the 5th. At this point, not on his full evil character arc, he is just starting out.
In charge yet.
And we see a bit of his backstory, because we are obviously going to be covering Adolf in a lot more detail as we go on through the years, when we look at the Second World War particularly, but also in the run-up to it in Germany and Europe. Hitler will pop up again and again. So it's quite interesting, I think, to see what forces helped shape him as an individual and a character. And certainly his First World War experiences were key. What was myth and what was reality? Part of the way that Hitler liked to portray himself was as someone who had fought and bled for Germany, and someone who wanted to right the perceived wrongs of the Treaty of Versailles, in which Germany was, according to him, very hard done by, and particularly the people who have fought and bled for Germany in the First World War weren't treated well, and he considered himself among these people.
The lost cause myth.
Yeah. So interestingly, Hitler maybe doesn't justify the war hero tag, because he was a reluctant soldier. He originally dodged the draft into the Austrian army in Vienna.
Do we know why, or are there any theories as to why?
He claimed that there were too many mixed bloods and different cultures in the ranks. Others have claimed that he was just like weak and feeble, and probably wasn't up to passing the physical exam for it. And yeah, when they did catch up with him, this was actually the case, and he was deemed unfit to bear arms. He went to Munich though, after he dodged the draft in Vienna. And he was in Munich at the outbreak of war, and there's a picture of him, a fascinating picture, I think one of the earliest pictures, if not the earliest picture of Hitler. When war is declared, he goes out to the Odeonsplatz in Munich, and there's a picture of the whole crowd listening to the announcement of war, and there's a grinning Hitler, like some eagle-eyed sleuth has identified this chap with a moustache as Hitler. And yeah, he's got a sort of happy grin on his face at the thought of war.
I've never seen this picture, it's amazing.
And Hitler drops to his knees, apparently, and thanks heaven for letting there be a time when Germany would be fighting to save himself. I think this might be a little bit put on. He's writing this himself to make him look good. I think he probably
what's the source? Mein Kampf?
Yeah.
I know, we have to say it though. I know it is. You didn't want to say it, did you? This is from Mein Kampf, not.
Yeah. A lot of what we hear from Hitler at this time, we had to take with a pinch of salt because the sources are not reliable, shall we say. They're either himself or sometimes, interestingly, some of his comrades. But
it's hard to know, but given how the Nazis falsified and changed history and records, it's difficult to dig stuff out, right? You never quite know what's real.
And Hitler was notorious for whitewashing his past as well, and going around and rounding up those who might have had a dissenting opinion, or who might have been wanting to say something different, and either expunging them from the record or putting them into a mild position of power so they were more grateful to him, and so on.
If you don't believe in absolute evil, why did you create the Dark Lord, who seems to be the apotheosis of it?
But he said in the book that he himself was not evil to begin with.
He fell. Then, like Lucifer.
Hitler, he enlists actually in the Bavarian army, despite being Austrian. Originally, he's turned away because the army has more volunteers than it needs at the beginning, which very common, not just in Germany, but in all of the mobilized countries. There was this big rush to join up, this wave of patriotism, before the brutal reality of the conflict dawned on people. It's not long before he's called up and enlists as a private in the 16th Bavarian Reserve Infantry Regiment. And we don't really know much about his early life in this regiment. There is a comrade who he was serving with named Hans Mend, who later wrote a book about his First World War experiences, something along the lines of I served with Adolf Hitler. And apparently when Hitler was issued his first rifle, he looked at it with delight, as a woman looks at her jewellery, which made me laugh.
Bloody Hitler, Jonny. What was his rank?
Hitler started off as private, but he distinguished himself actually in one of the first and only frontline actions that he was involved in. So he was sent to the front line relatively early in the war, in October 1914, in the Battle of Ypres. And he was involved in a few attacks and defences of a farmhouse. He did quite well. He wasn't.
The sheep.
He was firing his rifle, which he looked at like a woman, firing his beloved rifle. And at one point, a shell was exploding near him and killing killing the person standing next to him. That Hitler claims he only had a sleeve ripped away, and this is the first, like, we hear of a few near-death instances with Hitler. Again, he's trying to perhaps big up his wartime experiences by saying he was injured or close to being injured all these times. In reality, we don't really know whether it was true or not.
Often narcissists claim that each near-death thing is a sort of like a, it's just validating my purpose. We could point out, we won't, but Nigel Farage has had a few as well. Oh, sorry, did I say Nigel Farage? Sorry, that's a Hitler.
In the Somme, he's promoted. By the time we get to the Somme, he's been promoted, and he's no longer a soldier, a private serving on the front line. He's rather a runner, a regimental dispatch runner, and this is a job that is quite dangerous, depending on what the situation on the front is like, but it's nowhere near as dangerous as a frontline soldier. Basically, what the runner is doing is he's sort of hunching through the trenches and diving into shell holes to deliver these messages. There are historians who point out the fact that Hitler's type of runner wasn't nearly as dangerous as like the frontline runner. He was probably, for the most part, running his messages behind the actual action. So he wasn't really in like dire peril. But Hitler is very much keen to point himself out as often being under heavy fire and in a fair bit of danger.
Yeah, because they sort of there's this. Well, it's this particular source, a Jewish historian, Dr. Weber, has sort of gone back through all the documents, and he's saying that the idea that Hitler's radicalized in the war, etc., isn't true, and it's more like Hitler has a very different war experience to others. He's behind the lines, delivering messages between regimental headquarters, sort of ground-nosing. Again, as we know, this is all quite shrouded in mystery, but that's the interesting pivot, isn't it, of opinion. It's very hard to track him down, old Hitler. Or the idea is Hitler had quite a fairly jolly time with a few hiccups behind the lines, and thus came out of it thinking like, war's great, you just get to bundle around and deliver messages and salute.
Some truth in that, but we should also paint perhaps a slightly nuanced picture of his early battles, particularly, because he is, at least in the initial stages of the war, fighting on the front line, and he is on record as saying that it wasn't long before his enthusiasm cooled and fear of death strangled my exaggerated jubilation. So he is aware of the fact that he got carried away with it to begin with, and then like the reality hits. And I think he is quite grateful that he is taken out of the firing line, so to speak, and running messages. But that's not to say he's completely out of danger, because the reason he got promoted, officer who had just been wounded, out of danger, he got an Iron Cross for this. And they don't just give out Iron Crosses for nothing.
If I may, Jonny, actually, they basically did give them out for nothing.
Actually, Hitler got 2 Iron Crosses. The second Iron Cross he got very much, it's been sort of suggested that because he was cozying up with his superiors putting himself in a position for the recommendation for the Iron Cross, he got it for not any great act of bravery, just like doing his job, running messages between the lines. But his first Iron Cross, he went with his commander, Captain Engelhardt, to inspect a British position. There was Hitler and a comrade of his called Balthasar Brandemeyer, and the Captain Engelhardt stood up to see the British trenches better and instantly drew fire. And it was Hitler and Brandemeyer who sort of stepped in and dragged Engelhardt away when he was slightly wounded. So he was stepping up into fire, and for this action got the Iron Cross, the first one. The second one, much more likely that he got it without really perhaps deserving it, or not deserving it as much as he would lead you believe.
Why did he only ever wear one?
I don't know. More prestigious version of the Iron Cross.
I suppose he always had a spare one then, anyway.
Even at this point, we have some odd characteristics of Adolf that is setting him apart from the other men. He wasn't very sociable. He was very much a loner. When there were lulls in combat,
fellowship.
Yeah, he didn't have a fellowship like John Ronald did.
He's just Gollum, isn't he? He's Gollum with his rifle.
There is something a little bit Gollumish about him. He's either like reading philosophical works or sketching away with his watercolors. Like everyone knows that he's a failed artist, but he took his paint box to the trenches and was always sketching in low moments.
Just like Tolkien
going on.
In a different sense. Two artists in the trenches. Only one will become successful as an artist.
Indeed.
Can you guess who?
Indeed. He never drank. He never smoked. He never showed any interest in women. Particularly when others were like talking about their visits to prostitutes or sharing smutty stories, Hitler would always like make a point to stand up and leave in disgust. And there are reports of when he sees other soldiers flirting with French women, he reprimands them about like the sins of the flesh, and it's all a bit moralizing, a bit judgmental.
I've got a really good buzz-off of that for J.R.R. Tolkien, whose friends sort of teased him a bit. So Tolkien obviously still criticised now in some ways the representation of women, but his friends at the time were a bit like, he was like, say, the Frodo, and his friends, Merry, Pippin and Sam, who were, too busy knocking back an ale and eyeing up the barmaid to notice the shadow coming over that only Frodo can see. We should be careful in comparing, saying these are similarities between Tolkien and Hitler, but it is interesting how little things slip in. And don't forget, they will both become darlings of the sort of far right. Tolkien, not by any deliberate urge, but there's something in the old tales of lost kings and Anglo-Saxon creation myths and the idea of the other and the east and the west.
Indeed. Well, Hitler was often spending long periods of time sort of sitting, holding his head in his hands in silence, contemplating. And when someone would ask him, "Hey, Adolf, what's up?" He would sometimes get very animated, and there's this chap Hans Mend, who is one of the only sources we have of Hitler's time in the trenches, written by someone who wasn't Hitler. He was explaining how suddenly Hitler will leap up and run about excitedly and say that, "In spite of our big guns, victory will be denied us, for the invisible foes of the German people were a greater danger than the biggest cannon of the enemy." So already here, Hitler is seeing like shadowy forces at work.
And demonstrating
when he's in the trenches, he sees
terrible mental illness.
In hand.
Like, it's so Gollum.
I like the comparison to Hitler to Gollum because he does have sort of like a Gollum motivating item that he's picked up in the trenches. And this is a little dog called Foxel, which means like little fox, little foxy. And him and Hitler are sort of described as being almost inseparable. And Hitler calls him his little circus clown dog, and he's teaching him tricks. And this was a dog that sort of wandered over from the British trenches and fallen into the German trenches, and Hitler and his buddies looked after him and sort of adopted him as their group mascot. So Hitler formed quite a close relationship with this dog. And then in 1917, the dog and Hitler are at a train station, and Hitler's going for some rest and recuperation. And there's a postmaster, a French postmaster, who asks if he can buy the dog off Hitler because he's enamoured by the tricks. And Hitler says, no, absolutely not. This dog is like his precious, like his one humanizing factor, you could say. Like he's formed this nice close relationship with this dog. Hitler goes away just for a few moments, leaves his bag and the dog, and when he gets back, all his paints and sketches and the dog have been stolen. And apparently Hitler is incandescent with rage and goes into a depression. And he says about how distraught he is, and how the swine who took him from me doesn't know what he did to me. So this little foxy was very precious to Hitler, and it's about this time that you see like increasing psychopathic tendencies in Hitler, and he's more and more talking about the Jews in a negative way to his comrades. He's making inflammatory remarks, and the men, his comrades, are sort of catching on to this as well, and they go out of their way to tease Hitler and like wind him up and gleefully watch him fume about how the Germans couldn't afford to lose. So I think there is like a moment almost when Hitler's psyche snaps, and perhaps it can be traced to the loss of this little dog, Fuchsel.
I think Hitler would love us to believe that that's what made him go nutto, but I think he already was. Also, I don't like. I've heard variations on this, like as ever. What I heard, there's some version of the story where Hitler shoots the dog, which is very unlikely. But it's interesting how all this, because again, I was just waiting for that to turn into and I believe the person who stole the dog was insert like political enemy or religion or minority here.
So yeah, what was Hitler doing in the Somme? Pretty much what he'd been doing most of the war, running messages between
the only measure that he knows is desire for power.
He's wounded at the Somme, actually. He gets a piece of shrapnel in his thigh. He's shipped back to Germany in October to treat his wound. He's really not happy though in Germany, and he wants to get back to the front as quickly as possible.
Which year is this, Solstrom?
This is in the Somme, 1916. So in October he is wounded.
So he goes out as well about the similar time to Tolkien. Mm-hmm. He doesn't write The Fall of Gondolin, I assume, while he's convalescing. We
don't really know what Hitler is writing. He is writing some poetry, actually. There are a few of his poems. I've only read the translations, and they're very bad.
Can you give
not really worth exploring. I imagine his poetry and writing at this point was similar to his painting. Not very good.
Why do you say that? I mean, I agree, but just to draw it out about his painting, people say there's a lack of humanity about them.
Yeah, they're just really mundane. I've only seen like his sketches of cityscapes and like landscapes, and they're just really boring, really dull. Like nothing jumps out at you about them. We don't have any record of his trench sketches, though, which is interesting. I wonder what his trench sketches would have looked like. What he was sketching in the trenches. Almost a shame that his sketches got purloined because
we probably have three guesses as to what those sketches were.
Interestingly, Hitler spun a whole yarn about how he got this Iron Cross. And he maintained that he got this Iron Cross not just from delivering messages, but because he personally captured 10 French prisoners. And he spins this story of like how he jumped into a trench while delivering a message and saw 10 Frenchmen sheltering there and pulled out his pistol and single-handedly marched them to the German lines. And that is how he'd gotten his medal. It's really just an attempt to cover up the fact that he got it for doing what he was expected to do. And interestingly, he was recommended his second Iron Cross by a Jewish officer, which he never mentions.
Exactly, and I think his accounts start to disappear later on, specifically.
And the way Hitler is a very untruthful narrator of his time in the trenches comes up again at the end of his war, when August 19, his regiment is hit by a chlorine gas attack, and Hitler can't get his gas mask on in time and is allegedly blinded by the gas, and he's like stumbling away blind to the hospital where he lies recovering in bed. Then on the 10th of November, he gets the message that the war is over, and he goes into like a psychosomatic relapse of the blindness and like buries his head in the pillow and weeps. And he's so shocked by the fact that Germany's capitulated, given in, thrown in the towel, that he goes blind again. But there are now debates over whether he even went blind at all in the first case through this gas, or whether he just sort of panicked and thought he went blind.
Sounds like him.
Because the doctor said there was no serious or lasting damage to his eyes, which you might expect from a chlorine gas attack, and that they were sore from rubbing them, not from the gas, which was suggested that it was sort of a mental blindness.
And he's always got his head in his hands, so he's probably rubbing them then.
Yeah, and Hitler is spinning this this story later. It's like he's willed his vision to return, and he's used this time in the hospital to recuperate and plan like his grand vision for Germany. So like he's spinning his story of blindness and then coming to see, and maybe he's using this for political purposes later on, when in reality he just got some itchy eyes from a bit of gas, perhaps like a little bit. It's really hard to pin Hitler down.
I know. I can hear you occasionally coming across a story and being like, oh God, where does this come from? Is Phil going to accuse me of being pro-Hitler? Like, I can really feel your trauma. I mean, we are here at the Somme with Hitler.
Yeah, well, we're discussing Hitler. We're living his Somme.
The time machine's just like jolting.
Yeah. As I say, I think we have to take everything that Hitler says about his exploits in the trenches with a pinch of salt.
Sorry, I don't know why I thought. Quickly though, Johnny, here's a little quote that could describe Hitler. The only measure that he knows is desire for power. Gandalf the Grey of Sauron, he said. That could apply to Hitler in a way.
He does like his power, doesn't he?
Yes.
You give him a taste, and he really runs away with it.
And he sucked deep from the power, and not properly channeling his rage into creativity like J.R.R. Tolkien. Although, by the way, Tolkien had a fairly tricky early background, but he did end up at public school in Oxford. Did Hitler have that? Oh no, now I'm playing into Hitler's...
No, Hitler was from a relatively normal background. Nothing special.
So was Tolkien, but he kind of lucked into it through the Catholic Church, actually, I think. Yeah, bloody hell.
Yeah, I mean, he was
Hitler!
As the man who has made the Lord of the Rings, would you rather be remembered as a man who has said something or as a man who has made something?
I don't think you can distinguish.
He was down and out, down on his luck at the outbreak of the war, and looking for lodgings and places to eat after his failed stab at being an artist. But I think we can definitely see the beginnings of Hitler's sort of fantasies, his own fantasy for Germany, forming in the First World War, and his experiences of the trenches, him having like a traumatic experience, and this tainting his worldview somewhat, particularly in the aftermath of it, how he's always looking for people to blame for the loss in the First World War, and just not really processing events in a particularly healthy way, shall we say.
Whereas Tolkien said, I have always been impressed that we are here, surviving, because of the indomitable courage of quite small people against impossible odds. The hobbits, he explained, were a reflection of the English soldier. made small of stature to emphasize the amazing and unexpected heroism of ordinary men at a pinch.
Yeah, I think if we're looking for those who can sum up the First World War experience, certainly Tolkien does it much better than Hitler does. Hitler's looking for blame and trying to see the shadowy hand of Jews everywhere selling people out. Whereas Tolkien is coming up with gems like, alas, there are some wounds that cannot be wholly cured.
Like a missing ball in Hitler's alleged case.
Yeah, actually, this is interesting. The allegation that Hitler only had one bollock does stem to his time in the Somme, because, as mentioned, he was wounded in the thigh, and this, well, not exactly common knowledge, did get out during the Second World War that he was wounded in the thigh, and the rumour spread that this wound had sort of castrated one of his bollocks off.
It's the Albert, and it's ended up at the Albert Hall. According to this playground rhyme, even in a forsaken land at the threshold of Mordor, Samwise Gamgee apprehends this. For like a shaft, clear and cold. Oh no, I don't need to do it in that voice. Sorry. For like a shaft, clear and cold. The thought pierced him that, in the end, the shadow was only a small and passing thing. And there was light and high beauty forever beyond its reach.
Yeah, that's a very good quote. I think there is some optimism in Tolkien's work that, you go through these horrific battles and turmoil of the war, the War of the Rings, but for the hope of a better future.